Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore how consciousness works from a cognitive perspective. This is the first program in a three-part series with Dr. Bernard Baars, the author of The Cognitive Revolution in Psychology, a cognitive theory of consciousness, and he's also the editor of a journal called Consciousness and Cognition. Dr. Baars is on the faculty of the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. Welcome, Bernie.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you with me.
Nice to be here.
You know, when we think about consciousness or even cognition, it's somewhat remarkable to reflect back on the history of psychology and to realize that for some 50 or 60 years, mainstream academic psychology tried very hard to deny that it was even a valid subject for inquiry.
Yes, it's one of the most extraordinary things. It's, I think, some of us are still trying very hard to explain that period to ourselves because psychologists were very clearly serious about doing good scientific work. And if you're going to do good scientific work, clearly you want to look at the big phenomena around you. If you're going to do geology, you want to look at the strata of the rocks and so on, the big things that stand out. And consciousness stands out fairly obviously as one of the big issues in human beings. And nevertheless, by about 1913, consciousness was pretty much expelled from scientific psychology and ignored for 5 or 6 decades.
There were even some psychologists who went so far as to suggest that the mind doesn't really exist, not just psychologists, even philosophers.
Yes, absolutely. There was a consensus among philosophers and certain psychologists that mind was a bad word to use. And that only came unraveled fairly recently. I think by the 60s and 70s, there started to be a major shift within scientific psychology. And sort of by the 80s and 90s, we're beginning to really take another look at consciousness again, but now hopefully from a more perhaps enlightened or advanced or thorough scientific perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back and reflect again on the history of psychology. Mm-hmm. Originally, if we look at the work of William James, the great American psychologist, some people suggest still the greatest American psychologist, he was very interested in consciousness. I think he maintained that all psychology would be the science of conscious experience, that every psychological event could be broken into units of conscious experience. What happened?
Well, James obviously is still a wonderful source. Everybody goes back and reads a little bit about James, of his really core aphorisms about major problems in psychology, where he said the best thing that's ever been said. On the other hand, James was very much at odds with himself about some things, and one of the things he was fighting with himself about was the issue of consciousness and whether consciousness was going to be fundamental to psychology, or whether the other part of psychology, James was a medical doctor, and good medical doctors in the 19th century were trained to be physicalists. You had to explain everything in terms of clear physical phenomena. And James was at odds with himself about that. In the first 5 or 6 chapters of the Principles of Psychology, he takes every single conceivable position on the mind-body problem and never really resolves it. Toward the end of his life, in fact, by about 1904, he begins to question whether consciousness is really a useful concept for psychology. So James himself was very ambivalent about this, and by 1913, the founder of behaviorism, radical behaviorism at least, John Watson, comes along and gives this devastating paper on why psychology can exist without reference to consciousness. And within the next 10 years, the whole field moves over and takes that position.
Well, that's quite extraordinary, and I suppose the ambivalence that James himself felt, or the many positions that he took, were a reflection of the whole several thousands of years of philosophical debate on the same subject.
Yes, I think you have a swinging pendulum, certainly in Western philosophy and perhaps even in Eastern philosophy, between mentalism, the claim that consciousness is fundamental, is the most fundamental thing, and physicalism, the idea that everything can be reduced and explained in terms of neurons and molecules. Modern scientists are very much on the physicalistic end of this as a group, although there are individuals, of course, who feel very differently about it within science.
Now, as a cognitive psychologist, you're developing, I suppose, a fresh perspective on these things that attempts in some way to bypass this mind-body debate.
In a way, yes. My own view on it is that the mind-body problem, the various positions on whether reality is really mental or physical, is a fundamental problem. It's not a problem that as a scientist you ever get to resolve. And so we have to try to do science within a framework where what we do empirically will last. And the fact is that even though behaviorists didn't believe in consciousness, a lot of their research tells us a lot about consciousness. So I think as a psychologist, ultimately you cannot ignore consciousness no matter what position you take on the mind-body problem. And so you confine yourself to understandable and testable scientific questions. That's basically what cognitive psychology is. It's an attempt to look at things in the most testable way and just let's not get caught up in the major philosophical issues.
Now, the early psychologists of the 19th century developed an experimental method known as introspection, in which they asked people to sort of turn inwardly and describe the contents of their mind in various experimental contexts. This approach was highly criticized by the behaviorists, wasn't it?
It was. It was the major point of attack by behaviorists and philosophers who were behaviorists, and some people from physiology, like Pavlov, who was the discoverer of the conditioned reflex.
The Russian physiologist.
The Russian physiologist, right, who criticized psychologists and said, in fact, psychology is not possible, because psychology to Pavlov meant an understanding of consciousness in scientific terms. So psychology was very much attacked on that issue of introspectionism. It turns out from modern historical research that a lot of the reasons they were attacked were not true. They were basically just points of attack. We're still doing introspectionism every day in psychology. We ask people about their experiences. There are major parts of our lives that are affected by psychological research that are based on experiences. For example, if you look at your stereo, your audio system, it's graded in terms of decibels, and decibels are graded that way because of what's known as the psychophysical law, which is the relationship between the physical stimulus and the psychological perception of that stimulus. This was discovered 150 years ago. It's still good science, and the fact that it was discovered by people who were strong mentalists, who really believed that consciousness is the basis of the universe, doesn't matter very much. It's still very important in good science.
Well, the field of psychophysics was discovered by Gustav Fechner, the German researcher who also wrote many tracts about the nature of the human soul and even the soul life of plants, which brings up an interesting point, and that is that the very word psychology, if we take it back to its Greek origin, means the science or the study of the soul.
Right, and the soul obviously has something to do with consciousness.
Yeah, but the people who dominated the field for many decades and called themselves psychologists actually preferred the term behavioral scientist or behaviorists. They wanted to do away with the notion of the soul completely.
Right, there was a tremendous thrust to only talk about those things that are physicalistically observable, the stimuli that come into one's sensory organs, and the responses that you perform that are visible from the outside. So stimulus response behaviorism became really the dominant point of view, not because people didn't recognize that there were mental images, for example, but because they thought that there was really only one good, approved, orthodox way of doing science. And I think we've freed ourselves up a little bit.
there was a time, I suppose, when it's fair to say that poets and artists and writers, philosophers, historians, people in the humanities were all writing and thinking and talking about consciousness, and psychology was sort of going blithely along in a different direction as if none of this was of any relevance.
You're right. It's an extraordinary paradox. I mean, psychologists were bright people. You know, they're interested in lots of things. And right around 1900, there was a tremendous movement towards stream of consciousness writing, as shown in Joyce and Los Passos and other kinds of novelists and poets of the time. B.F. Skinner, who later on became the standard bearer of radical behaviorism, the behaviorism that denies consciousness, started off as a writer. His initial training was to become a novelist, and his ambitions were to become a novelist, and the kind of writing that he steeped himself in was stream of consciousness writing. And so we have this extraordinary story of this person within a single lifetime, or even within a single year of his life, in which he encounters a crisis and moves from wanting to become a stream of consciousness novelist to the very opposite extreme, where he is a psychologist and a behaviorist who denies the possibility of being conscious. It's one of the major psychological puzzles of the history of science, I think.
Let me ask you, Bernie, what got you involved in the study of consciousness?
Well, it's a slightly long story. I think all of us growing up in the 60s were interested in big issues, and I was interested in big philosophical issues. And then I began to read some philosophy, and the contemporary philosophy at that time, which is very much like behaviorism, said that philosophers really can't do anything. They can't do anything but study the language of scientists.
Logical positivism,
right,
in effect.
Logical positivism was the dominant view in philosophy as I was reading it at that time, and it didn't inspire me very much. It wasn't interesting to do philosophy at that time. And the thing that appeared to be interesting was to do psychology. And as I discovered after a while when I was at the university, the classes that I took were not nearly as interesting as many of the things that I could read outside of the classes. Work by Freud, work by Nietzsche, work by stream of consciousness, psychological novels, all sorts of interesting things. I finally found myself involved with meditation and meditated for quite a long time before I overcame my skepticism and realized that there was something very powerful going on there. I didn't know what it was. I didn't understand or believe that there were really good, persuasive sources of evidence on this. There were lots of people who knew lots about it, but they were not able to persuade skeptics, scientific skeptics particularly, about it. And so I decided that consciousness was really a terribly important problem. What also became clear, however, was that scientists weren't anywhere close to dealing with higher states of consciousness. And so it became rather clear at that point that some kind of bridge needed to be developed between ordinary psychology, scientific psychology, and ordinary consciousness and these extraordinary states of consciousness on the other hand. And so I've been working on the ordinary side.
Now, you mentioned Freud a moment ago, and of course he's had an extraordinary influence on 20th century culture, maybe one of the 5 or 6 most influential thinkers of the century.
Yes.
And he pioneered the exploration of the unconscious, and we think of him as one of the founder of modern psychiatry.
Right.
Yet in the field of psychology, Freud was something of an anathema.
Right. It's very much the same sort of thing, that psychology has been able to exclude what are culturally terribly important people and topics like consciousness and the psychodynamic unconscious. And yet scientific psychology has sort of been able to build a wall around itself and exclude that. Now, to some extent, that's necessary to do good science. You have to stay within the terms of the debate and the evidence that you can obtain. But to some extent, it's, as one of the philosophers that I know says, it's scandalous that psychologists really haven't dealt either with consciousness or with Freudian thought any more than they have.
Well, of course, you have, and we plan to talk a good deal about your work, and in laying the groundwork for that, I think we should talk about what happened. The behaviorist approach I think is well agreed, is fizzling out or has fizzled out.
Yes, definitely.
Let's talk about that briefly. The cognitive approach is now becoming, if it's not already, the dominant approach.
I think it is the dominant approach at this point. There are several different meanings for cognitive, as you might expect with something that becomes popular within a field. It's clear that behaviorism ran into very deep troubles around 1950, and that created a crisis within behaviorism. People had tremendous confidence and tremendous enthusiasm for the behavioristic approach to learning, for example. And then at the very moment when people expected great success in a theory of learning about 1950, the thing fell apart. The program fell apart, and by its own criteria became untenable. And after that point, you have a period of tremendous confusion for about 10 years.
When you say by its own criteria became untenable, what precisely do you mean?
Well, the particular effort that everybody was terribly excited about in the late 40s and early 50s was an attempt by Clark Hall, then a professor at Yale University, to put together a theory of learning and a theory of motivation that would have no reference whatsoever to any mentalistic ideas. It would be purely based upon stimulus-response learning. And Clark Hall really gathered a tremendous movement behind him to do that. And people ran dozens of experiments with rats going through mazes, and were very interested in the next article that would come out in Psychological Review, the main theoretical journal, by Clark Hall, to see what the next move would be. And then at some point, it became clear that the whole enterprise was too fuzzy and was too circular, so that there was really not a stable basis for a theory at that point. Partly because people demanded that theory never involve anything that could not be publicly observed. So if you commit yourself to only dealing with physical stimuli and physical responses, you don't deal with mental images, you don't deal with goals that people can talk about, you don't deal with people's memories or anything like that. That was Clark Hall's program. He said you didn't have to deal with any of that. And the whole creation fell apart. And in a way, this is a compliment to the behaviorists, because they set very, very tight criteria for what constituted a good theory. And at some point, Hullian theory became untenable, and everybody admitted that it became untenable. And at that point, they could no longer really feel that this behavioristic approach would drive them inevitably toward a greater understanding of human beings.
And I guess at the same time, you had in the very scientific field of computer science, the emergence of artificial intelligence, and people developing very sophisticated mathematical models of how machines might actually process information and store memories and perform computations.
Right, and it's sometimes difficult for people to understand that by comparison to stimulus-response behaviorism, the computer was a liberating tool. It was a tool that showed you that tremendous complexity could be embodied in a fairly simple machine. And since we have a nervous system that is many orders of magnitude more complicated than a computer, you had to give up the very simplistic approach of assuming that everything was just understandable in terms of little chains of stimuli and responses. So in a way, the computer was a very humanizing tool in scientific psychology.
Yeah. Now let's begin to talk about the elements of your own theory of consciousness. You talk about consciousness in some very elegant and simple ways. You talk about conscious experience, for example, and then the unconscious contexts in which we have our conscious experience.
Yes, well, the most obvious observation, I suppose, that we can make is that there are some things in the human nervous system that are conscious, and an awful lot of the human nervous system that is not conscious. If you were to cut out a piece of cortex, for example, a person would not lose consciousness. if you were to cut out a tiny little bit of the brainstem, a person would go into coma. So there are small pieces of the nervous system that are clearly involved with consciousness. There's huge parts of the nervous systems that are unconscious. Now, the plausible story that I think everybody believes at this point within psychology and neuroscience is that most of the unconscious parts are very specialized. So you have a piece of cortex right over here that is very specialized in the production of speech, going from a thought to a sentence frame, to words, to pronunciation by this tremendously complex speech mechanism that we have. And that little piece of cortex is specialized in that, and it obviously cannot deal very well with visual processing or with planning for the long-term future or with a number of other functions that the human nervous system does marvelously well. So little pieces of cortex seem to be very, very good at one thing, but not very good at everything else. So we can think of those as expert systems. And one way to think about consciousness, which is actually a metaphor that goes back to Plato, is to say that we have an audience of many, many expert systems, and what comes into consciousness is, in a way, on the stage of the theater in front of that audience. The stage is lit up, that's what we're conscious about. There are movements behind the scenes of the director and the playwright and so on, people moving scenery back and forth between the acts. And the audience itself is not visible either, but the audience combines to pay attention to something that's on stage. This goes all the way back to Plato's metaphor of the cave. And it's been a very useful way of thinking about consciousness. I have a slightly modernized version of that, a more formal way of talking about that, but the essence was already captured a long time ago.
In Plato's metaphor, the people in the cave are looking at the shadows on the wall.
Right, right. And it's as if you're bound, Plato argued, and a prisoner in a cave, and there's a fire behind you. And this is way before technology begins to show up, of course. There's no knowledge about projectors and films and so on. But you did know that if you had a fire in a cave and somebody walked in front of the fire, the shadow of that person would be projected onto the wall. And for Plato, of course, this is a way of saying we perceive so little of the real underlying reality. We just perceive the shadows of reality. Well, that may be true, but whatever we do perceive is still very important to a psychologist.
Another metaphor that you use to describe consciousness is like a broadcasting system, a much more modern metaphor that takes crucial information and broadcasts it to all the various little subsystems, the expert systems that you described, and that many different parts of the nervous system are vying for access onto the broadcast system.
Yes, you have competition for access to the system, as if the different members of the audience are trying to get up to the theater, up to the stage rather, and they're sort of fighting each other. And only if they can get enough of a coalition together, this is a little bit like Congress actually, enough of a coalition together to be able to broadcast from the stage, only then can you have a coherent message coming through and be broadcast to the nervous system as a whole. And this is, as I say, it's an old metaphor, but it's still somewhat controversial within neuroscience and psychology, although, again, I think the movement is very much in this direction.
So in building your theory, you're looking for a few simple, easy to understand metaphors that you can use then to organize a large body of experimental data and even to make predictions.
Right. It's normal science. My assumption is that consciousness can be approached the way we approach any other basic problem in science. The way we do that is by looking for facts that are reliable and that seem to have a bearing on the issue that we're interested in. Then we have all those facts together, and there are dozens and dozens of facts that have a specific bearing on consciousness. They're kind of everyday facts, the kind of facts that we encounter all the time. You look at them together and then you see what that constrains in terms of a theory. What does that mean? What kind of a story can you tell that will fit all of those facts at the same time? And it turns out that this global workspace theory, this which suggests the existence of a workspace or a stage on which many, many different specialized processors can operate, they can compete for access to it, and then they can broadcast their messages globally throughout the system, that kind of story may well be the best story. I haven't seen a better one so far. Be happy to listen to better stories.
And one of the primary analytical methods that you use is the method that you call contrastive analysis, in which you take a particular psychological phenomenon and compare an experiment in which this psychological process, let's say, is done consciously with one in which the same process is done unconsciously.
Right. Contrastive analysis is a little bit of a fancy term for something that is really very obvious. If you take your memory of this morning's breakfast, if you can bring that to mind right now, somehow that memory is conscious at this moment, but it's been there since breakfast. It's been there for some hours, obviously, unconsciously. So we have a conscious representation and we have a similar unconscious representation. And the argument is that any complete theory of consciousness has to explain the difference between these very similar representations, one of which is conscious, the other one is unconscious. You can find dozens of pairs like that.
And when you look at all of these pairs together, it's as if what they begin to indicate to you is something like the contours of consciousness itself.
That's what I would argue. Obviously, there may well be lots of psychologists who would argue against me on that, but the evidence, I think, suggests that this is going on. And of course, scientifically, the evidence is what counts.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Bernard Baars, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I think your work has been of extreme importance and we'll continue to talk about it more, since this is the first of a three-part series, in outlining the nature of ordinary consciousness, something of a springboard to look at higher states of consciousness and extraordinary consciousness. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us, and please continue to watch Thinking Aloud for parts 2 and 3 of this series of programs on the workings of consciousness from a cognitive perspective.